Hello, and welcome to our first post-lockdown event. The Romanoff Foundation, in cooperation with Grange Park Opera, is doing an event focused on Ivan the Terrible, the first Russian Tsar. Helena Barton, teacher at the Westminster School, will be enlightening us about him. We hope you enjoy.
I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this event with the Romanoff Foundation. It's the first one we've done together. So this morning we did a run with Bryn Terfel of Falstaff in the rehearsal room in London, and of course in the theatre in Surrey. All the sets have been built and they've been lit, and we're just putting together the last little combination of the sound and the visual and the orchestras, and then we'll be starting our season, which includes Rimsky-Korsakov's opera Ivan the Terrible.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining me here tonight at the Travellers Club, and thank you for the invitation to speak. It's really brilliant to be asked here to talk about one of the most interesting chapters in Russian history, and that is the reign of Ivan IV. But he's more commonly known to most of us as Ivan the Terrible, or indeed Ivan Grozny. It was really fantastic to get the call from Andrei asking whether I'd be happy to speak at such an event, and he knew me through his daughter Madeline and had therefore heard an awful lot about my love of Russian history. Whenever I meet people and they ask me what I do, and I mention that I'm a teacher, and in particular I teach Russian history, I've come to expect a few reactions. One of them is the potentially thoughtless reaction of, why Russian history? Which is then accompanied by some kind of oversimplified comment about current Russian politics, as if by my teaching of the subject, I'm kind of tacitly enforcing everything that the Russian government has done, is doing, might be about to do in the future. But fortunately, and I'm not, but fortunately, the more common reaction is one of, oh really? That's so interesting. Which particular period of Russian history do you study? Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Ivan the Terrible? And obviously, I always prefer this reaction, and I'm absolutely thrilled when it happens. The only problem then is that I have to rein myself in, because as Madeline probably told Andrei, I have a tendency to kind of tell everyone everything that I love about Russian history, so I shall try to restrain myself tonight. As Andrei mentioned, I've been a Russophile for a very long time now, and it's not just the history that I love, it is the Trans-Siberian Railway, the language, the culture, the food, all of it. And having said that, I would like to take a moment to beg your forgiveness tonight for any pronunciation errors. I'm aware that I'm probably among some very good, if not fluent, Russian speakers, and despite my efforts, I'm afraid that I remain very firmly and sadly a little bit of a Russian linguistic amateur. Indeed, русские часто говорят мне, что русский язык очень сложно выучить, и я с ними согласна. So, speaking of language and translation, when we talk about the history of Ivan, the first problem that we encounter is one of translation. When we say Ivan the Terrible, do we mean terrible, or do we mean Grozny, or something in between? And what I'd like to do tonight is try and address that, and somehow give you an answer. Before we fully get going, though, there is one more thing that I would like to talk about, and that's what makes this time so interesting to me. The period is shrouded in mystery, and this is because so many of the sources on Ivan are missing or damaged, destroyed, lost, and at best, highly questionable given their provenance. We can't even actually say for certain what Ivan looked like, as every description and all painted images of him are from actually after his time in power. The most famous image, which many of you might know, is the one by Ilya Repin of Ivan clutching his dead son. And whilst this is a fantastic and deeply evocative painting, it was nonetheless created 3 centuries after Ivan's death. So it actually only provides us with an artistic interpretation as opposed to an accurate comment on Ivan's life. The scarcity of documentation for Ivan's reign, spanning as it did almost half of the 16th century, is even more stark when we compare it to the same time period here in this country. When we look at the Tudor dynasty, for example, as any good A-level history student would, There's almost too much information, especially in comparison to the fragmented documentation on Ivan. With the Tudors, it really often feels like there's not very much to say, but with Ivan, the historiographical debate just keeps on raging. Historians really are having to do so much with very little. They're having to look at him in different ways, and they're ultimately trying to deduce a reasonable interpretation based on what they have. Indeed, something I'll touch on later, Tudor historians, I think, are so desperate for a new angle that they've actually been known to kind of dive into the reign of Ivan the Terrible to find it, namely his supposed marriage proposal to Elizabeth I, which was part of his efforts to form an alliance with England in the 1560s. It does sound bizarre to us initially, but there were actually strategic reasons for it from Ivan's perspective. But needless to say, it was a flat no. But my main aim, therefore, tonight is to try and provide you with an interpretation of Ivan's reign, and for you to be able to decide whether or not you think the nickname of terrible is deserved. I don't want to give you a definitive answer. Instead, I want you to be able to reach that conclusion yourself. To be honest, and she's now gone, so she won't be able to shame me by saying that this is very, very true. I've never really been good at concealing my opinion of historical figures. Were you to ask Maddie my opinion of Lenin, probably wouldn't bear repeating. So I don't think I'll manage a completely neutral tone, but I will try. And I'm very happy for everyone to reach a different conclusion. That really is one of the joys of history. So let's dive into the reign of Ivan IV, or indeed, Terrible or Grozny. Ivan is one of Russia's most infamous leaders, and I think this is because his reign really transformed Russia, both in terms of the size and structure of the country and how it changed, the geography, and the sheer scale of his acquisitions and conquests, but also in terms of the notorious violence that accompanied many of these events, and obviously, most controversially, the violence displayed and practiced by Ivan himself. For the purposes of this talk, I've decided to focus on three main areas: Ivan's ascension to the throne and his early reign, the later transformation in the 1560s, which is associated with his much more kind of erratic and punitive behavior and with the time of the Oprichnina, and finally, his legacy and reputation and what it means for us and for Russia. So, one of the first things to address about Ivan is that he's on the throne for a very, very long time. It's about 50 years, which, given the political machinations of the people around him, is particularly remarkable. As a point of contrast, again, sounding like the true A-level history teacher that I am, if we return to the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII would have been absolutely impressed by this, not quite managing 30 years himself, and Ivan's potential bride, Elizabeth I, managed only 45 years, so very paltry in compared to his 51. He inherited the throne at the age of just 3 in 1533, after the death of his father, Vasily III. Unfortunately for Vasily III, he is sometimes known as Vasily the Adequate, as his reign comes between Ivan's grandfather, known as Ivan the Great, and Ivan himself, Ivan the Terrible. I don't know which of those nicknames you'd want, but there we go. So Ivan inherits the throne in 1533, and he'll then go on to rule until 1584. Obviously, for the first part of this reign, he's a child, so therefore he's a minor, and his mother, Helena, is appointed with a council of 7 to rule for him. But a common theme that we'll start to see in Ivan's reign, the situation is not to be that stable for very long, and his mother and 5 of the 7 members appointed to look after him are dead within just half a dozen years, either through poisoning, execution, imprisonment, or I think the technical term is suspicious circumstances. So after this, the young Ivan is, by all accounts, kind of left to his own devices, and somehow miraculously manages to survive his minority and make it to the throne. And I think that this has a real impact on him and leaves him with several very profound scars for the rest of his life. The first of those is a fundamental distrust of the nobility, the boyars that surround him. They do have a propensity to poison enemies, so we can see that Ivan has reasons. The second scar that he has is that the cutthroat nature of his childhood, the fact that he is so often in close proximity to violence and death, really leaves the young Ivan and the older Ivan with, I think, a slightly apathetic attitude towards death, violence, and mortality. It is noted in nearly every source that you'll read about Ivan that throughout his life, he likes to personally engage in violence, whether or not that's the torture of prisoners, the torture of animals, or the violence of campaign. And I think this really is something that he does for the whole of his life. Now, for me, some of those interpretations of Ivan get a little bit too psychoanalytical. People try and really pick apart the exact type of violence that he preferred. And I don't necessarily think that helps. But conversely, I don't think we can entirely dismiss the idea that there are obviously some ways that this is incredibly formative for Ivan. It leaves him unable to trust people around him, and his reign does become marked by an increasing paranoia and a tendency to dispense what is fairly grotesque levels of violence towards his subjects and enemies. But to return to the young Ivan and to put him finally on the throne, he reaches maturity at the age of 15 in 1545, and at this point he takes on the title Grand Prince of Moscow. He won't have this title for very long, however. He soon becomes the Tsar in 1547. And this is a fairly astonishing achievement and a very significant moment in Russian history. Although the title of Tsar, one that we're probably very familiar with, had been used informally and infrequently since the reign of Ivan's grandfather, Ivan the Great, Ivan IV was the first one to really formalize its usage, and it will then go on to obviously be the title used by all Russian rulers all the way through until 1917. In addition to this title change and the full assumption of power, there's another really significant moment in Ivan's life in 1546, which is his first marriage to Anastasia Romanova. As the name should indicate, this is not only a very significant moment in Ivan's life, but it also holds a lot of significance for the history of Russia. Although at the time his bride was considered to be an unusual and perhaps slightly left-field choice, I think we all know that their family was going to go on to have some impact on the history of Russia as we go forward. Now, I said first wife very deliberately, because in another superb outmaneuvering of the Tudor dynasty, Ivan would go on to actually have 8 wives throughout his reign, compared to Henry VIII's now seemingly paltry 6. But it's commonly agreed that obviously his first wife was far and away the most significant, both in terms of her family name, but also because of the positive influence that she was said to exert on the young Tsar. So, through these 2 events, crowning himself as Tsar, choosing a bride from a less influential family, we see what will really become a lifelong obsession for Ivan, and that is outlining and classifying the exact nature of his power and status. With these 2 acts, what he's really doing is challenging the ideas of the time as to what powers a ruler has. The Grand Prince of Moscow had traditionally been seen as really a first among equals, but a Tsar is different. They're a leader apart, a leader above, and they expect a different type of loyalty. When we combine this shift with the reforms that Ivan embarks upon in the first few years of his reign, we really begin to see why this early period is so significant. Not only does he embark upon a new codification of the law, he begins a clearer definition of the relationship between church and state, he attacks the power of local governors, and he basically creates a central civil service system. And we start to see, therefore, that the title of Tsar isn't simply about just stating his power, but it's actually about exerting it and showing it through actions to make that authority concrete and total. And then similarly with his choice of bride, Ivan again is showing his authority over the boyars. It was very traditional at the time for the leading families to present their daughters to the Grand Prince to marry. So by not choosing one of the more prominent families, Ivan is really stoking a controversy. Anastasia was considered by some, as I said, a very unusual choice. But what Ivan is really doing with that choice is shifting the balance of power to himself. So, moving away from titles and marriages, what I really want to do now is talk a little bit about the politics and the events that engulf Ivan's reign from the very beginning. As soon as he takes over the throne in 1547, Ivan's reign is swamped by tragedy. One of the first things that happens is the Great Fire of Moscow. For those of you that know anything about Russian history, you might be scratching your head, the Great Fire of Moscow, which one? And that absolutely is the question, because despite the many fires, they did keep rebuilding in wood for quite some time. But they learn eventually. And the Great Fire of Moscow that I'm talking about now in 1547 was actually a series of fires that lasted for nearly 3 months and destroyed basically about 1/3 to half of the city. Ivan personally obviously managed to avoid any danger. He was far outside Moscow, and he actually surprisingly manages to avoid some of the blame, instead managing to pass it on to some of the leading boyar families, or indeed just kind of blaming it on divine judgment, which I think must have been a very handy excuse back in the day. But after the fire, Ivan does still feel the need to do something for the people, and the method that he chooses to kind of cheer them up is one that many leaders choose, and that is acquisition of territory and glory through war. The war that Ivan chooses is one that will have profound significance for Russia. He chooses to attack the Khanate of Kazan. There are initial failures in the planning and organization of this, and several failed attempts to actually get the campaign going, several leavings of Moscow, several returnings of Moscow. But in 1552, the circumstances are right. The Khan of Kazan has just died, the Khanate is weak, Ivan senses his moment and his opportunity. From the Chronicles of Kazan, we know that this was the moment, and we know that the siege of Kazan was an outstanding success for the Russian forces. This is partly because the force is a lot larger than that of the Khanate of Kazan, but it's also because ultimately Ivan's army was more skilled. This provides an interesting point of kind of Anglo-Russian cooperation, which is that one of the reasons Ivan was successful in Kazan is that the sappers that laid the mines under the fortress were English, because at the time we were the best people that you could find in Europe for blowing things up successfully. So Ivan had specifically called in the sappers from England. Another thing that's very interesting about the siege of Kazan and its success is that it gives us a moment to pause on whether or not the nickname of terrible is deserved. Obviously, first of all, he is successful, so that's not so terrible. And second of all, at several moments during the siege, Ivan actually tries to use diplomacy as opposed to blowing things up in order to try and solve the situation. Now, I'm not suggesting that one use of diplomacy in one particular siege excuses many later incidences of violence, but it does nonetheless show that in this early stage of his reign, Ivan was capable of different methods of negotiation. And it won't be the last time he tries to use negotiation either, so that is something that he has in his favor. It would also be remiss of me not to note that the victory at Kazan is the opportunity that Ivan uses to then build a building that I'm sure is familiar to many of us, St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. He builds the cathedral to celebrate the victory, and I'm not remotely suggesting, again, that one brilliant piece of architecture is enough to excuse him of his terrible nickname, but it is a very beautiful building. So, continuing on with the theme of territorial acquisition, the next very significant event in Ivan's reign is another annexation, but this time of the Astrakhan Khanate, located next door to Crimea. This takes place between 1554 and 1556. And the really significant thing about these two acquisitions of Kazan and Astrakhan is that it brings in a totally new area of territory to Russia and access to new markets, which enriches the country. And also, for the first time, it brings in Muslim subjects under the control of a Russian ruler. As many of you will know, the Russian Empire, before its collapse in 1917 and after, was incredibly multi-ethnic. And so through these acquisitions, we're seeing the beginning of that process. So looking at these first few years of Ivan's reign, it's clear that many of the events are actually deserving of praise, as opposed to being described as terrible. But obviously, this is only the first part of a 51-year reign, so he has a little way to go to earn it. And what I'll discuss now is this transformation. Why does he move from being a relatively stable, relatively competent leader into being Ivan the Terrible? Before we move forward, I'm afraid I must briefly move backwards, and that's to return to Ivan's marriage to Anastasia. The pair remained, to all intents and purposes, happily married until her death in 1560. But after she died, Ivan was completely inconsolable and completely mad. Part of his anger is because he believed that she had been poisoned by people in his court. And this obviously has profound effects on his mental state. To pause for a moment, if I may, on the subject of poisoning in 16th century Russia, it goes without saying that it's an incredibly, incredibly common feature. The moment you dig into any history of the period, about half of the people die from poisoning. But it's also a very frustratingly opaque issue because at the time, people didn't know and people couldn't prove it. A lot of people in Ivan's life die through poisoning, and I think this does contribute to his paranoia. There are even suggestions that Ivan himself was poisoned in 1584, which is an alternative interpretation to the fact that he died from some kind of rage-induced stroke or aneurysm in the middle of a fight. And being in his early 50s at the time of his death, it's actually not totally outrageous that that is what could have happened to Ivan. I should point out, though, that obviously 50 was a fairly good lifespan for the 16th century, and also Ivan, as I'll explain, was a relatively, how shall I put it politely, hard-living man. So I think he might have just died of natural causes. But returning to Anastasia and her poisoning, it is now almost certain that she was poisoned, as recently the Russian state exhumed her body and proved conclusively that she had otherwise inexplicable levels of mercury in her body. So therefore, Ivan was completely right, but frustratingly for him, there's absolutely no way that he could have known this at the time. And after she died, there is a really clear change in his behavior. We rarely see the type of reforming zeal and relative stability that he displays in the early years of his reign. And despite the fact that Ivan would marry another 7 times, none of his other wives will have such an influence on him. In some ways, his marriages and the associated scandals could be a completely separate lecture. 3 more of them end in poisonings. 1 of them is only 16 days long, and 4 of them aren't actually officially recognized by the Russian Orthodox Church. So there's a lot to be said there. But in relation to his marriages, there are 3 things to note before we move on. Firstly, the change in behavior that will mark the second period of his reign. Then, the fact that according to all accounts that we have, he didn't personally kill or murder any of his wives. So again, something in the table for not terrible. And lastly, in spite of all of this matrimony, Ivan's succession was nonetheless going to be incredibly difficult. So, to return to the second phase of Ivan's reign. After the death of Anastasia, Ivan also had to deal with the fact that they had lost 4 children in their 12-year marriage. So when you add this to the suspicion of poisoning, it's very understandable that Ivan really did fall into a deep depression in the early 1560s. It's against this backdrop that we see some of the most dramatic events that happen in his reign, from the Livonian Wars through to his threatened abdication, the creation of the notorious Oprichnina, and finally, the horrific sacking of Novgorod, the setting of the opera. So it is these events in this kind of central part of Ivan's reign that really make him worthy of the name Terrible, as I hope to show you. So to start with the Livonian Wars, this is actually something that spans for nearly all of Ivan's reign, running as they do from 1558 to 1583, and they're frustratingly inconclusive and ultimately unsuccessful. They start for a very mundane reason, unpaid debt, but they're really about the balance of power in that northern Baltic part of the world. After initial Russian victories in the 1550s, it all really goes downhill and just descends into a long, protracted conflict that ultimately Russia will end up losing. The war is incredibly draining for Ivan, not just because of the finance, not just because of the time, but also because some of the very high-profile defections that happen from the Russian side as people increasingly tire of the conflict. One of the most famous is that of Andrei Kursky. Kursky had fought for Ivan in the victory of Kazan, and the two were, by all accounts, good friends. However, after being defeated by the Poles as part of the Livonian War, Kursky, quite rightly, in my opinion, thought that Ivan would murder him for the loss of the battle, and so decided to chance his arm and flee to Poland and seek amnesty. The 2 men then exchange a series of absolutely horrific letters that are filled with the most devastating insults, and they really do this for a very long time. They're very committed to this hatred, and it's from these Kursky letters that we get a lot of the information about Ivan being terrible. But I think the context helps explain perhaps why we might not get a brilliant light shed on him in those documents. And one final consequence of the Livonian Wars to mention is that it could potentially have contributed to the death of Ivan's heir, the Tsarevich, also named Ivan. But this obviously depends very definitely on one's interpretation. The version of events goes that, plagued by the suspicion that his generals were about to abandon him, the boyars were about to kind of sue for his removal, Ivan the Terrible thought that he had no time left and it was going to be his son on the throne instead. This sends him into a rage. He strikes his son dies, the tragic Ilya Repin picture ensues 3 centuries later. It's not a uniformly agreed upon version of events, but if true, the Livonian War is therefore a huge contributing factor to the difficulty of Ivan's succession. Moving on to the next area in which he earns his nickname of Terrible, that's his threatened abdication. Ivan would actually threaten to abdicate several times throughout his reign, and I think somehow the boyars just every time thought it was genuine. But nonetheless, he must have been very good at selling things. But he decides that he wants to abdicate in 1564 when, exhausted by the Livonian War, exhausted by the death of his wife, the death of his children, his own personal tragedy, he packs up and leaves Moscow. He sends a letter to the boyars saying that he can no longer go on with them. This puts them in a real difficulty. The boyars have no intention of having any kind of republic. That won't be good for them, but they also can't tolerate any kind of upheaval in their leadership. Anything like that would leave Russia deeply vulnerable to attack by any of the remaining enemies that she still has surrounding her. So therefore, something needs to be done. Why does Ivan do this, though? Is it just because everything is so much for him? Not really. It's actually a very, very tactical political move. He doesn't like working with the boyars. They're being very difficult, but he needs them to get on side. So he threatens to abdicate, and he issues a huge series of demands. And ultimately, the boyars give in to those demands because they can't tolerate the alternative, not having a steady leadership. Now, what does Ivan demand? Well, ultimately, he demands absolute power. So having already put himself on the throne as Tsar, he now demands that he can basically be the supreme leader, have no one to answer to. The boyars have much less authority. And as I said, they really have no choice. So we see here a new level of power given to the figure of Tsar. And one of the most important things that accompanies this is the creation of Ivan's own private army to enforce this absolute rule, and that is obviously the Oprichnina. Now, one of the few things that people know about Ivan is his nickname, that he was supposedly terrible. And the other thing that people might know about him is that he created the Oprichnina. It's basically a state within a state. And it's very difficult for me not to make parallels to modern organizations of kind of law enforcement and secret policing. But there are certainly a lot of parallels that one can draw with the creation of the Oprichnina, which foreshadow these more modern developments. Firstly, although the Oprichnina starts as a personal army, or a bodyguard for Ivan, really, it grows into an enormous organization of nearly 6,000 men within just its short existence. Secondly, the oath of loyalty that Ivan sets the Oprichnina is directly to him. They don't serve Russia, they only serve the Tsar. This means that their power is accountable only to the Tsar. And then lastly, the thing that most people know about the Oprichnina is their violent reputation. These men rode around on horseback in black cloaks with the severed dogs' heads attached to their horses, kind of foreshadowing the doom that they would rain down on people. And the greatest irony of all about the Oprichnina is that although it was designed to be an organization to bring Ivan strength and security and stability, ultimately it doesn't do any of those things. It makes him even more paranoid, even more complicated, and neither does it bring any strength or security to the country. Throughout the time of the Oprichnina, Russia remains embroiled in the Livonian War. It's the repeated victim of Crimean raids. It's hit by plague, it's hit by famine, it's hit by fire, and we don't see any change in behavior for the positive. And whilst there are many atrocities carried out by the Oprichnina during their thankfully short existence, the one that I'm going to focus on is, of course, the backdrop to the opera, his attack of Novgorod in 1570. Now, Ivan's choice of Novgorod is an interesting one. Why does he choose to rain down his punishment on that particular city? And as the opera addresses, why Novgorod and why not another city, for example, Pskov? Ultimately, because it's Ivan, there isn't really a rational answer, but I'm going to try and give you as best a one I can. Ivan ultimately has misgivings about the nobility in Novgorod. He thinks that they are treasonous, he thinks that they're plotting against him, and he thinks that therefore he needs to kind of bring them into line. Now, whilst these misgivings might have been partially true, because I think many people living in Russia at the time were incredibly unhappy with the situation, the punishment that Ivan metes out towards the people of Novgorod can in absolutely no way be described as proportional. In Novgorod, we truly do see why he earns his nickname of Terrible. Before his arrival in the city, Ivan has a moment not to be so terrible. The leading priests of the city ride out to meet him and try to persuade him that the city is innocent. It isn't the hotbed of conspiracy that he thinks it is. But all this really does is inflame Ivan's rage. Unlike in the 1550s when we saw him being willing to use diplomacy, he's not having any of it. This is the different, more erratic, more angry later Ivan. There is no propensity for clemency. Now, estimates vary widely about exactly what happened in the city and exactly how many people lost their lives. We know that initially at least 1,500 prisoners were killed within just the first 2 or 3 days of the attack, along with hundreds of members of the nobility. Even the city's clergy were not spared from Ivan's wrath, with several of them being paraded through the streets, tied naked to horses and whipped for humiliation. Now, what's shocking about Novgorod, apart from the scale of the tragedy and the range of people that were involved, is also the manner in which it was carried out. Apart from these more standard conventional executions, apart from these public humiliations, the Oprichnina employ some of their most notorious methods of death. They drove people into the freezing river to drown. They stabbed at them with pikes as they tried to swim away. They erected large cauldrons in the center of the city, filled them with boiling water, and boiled people to death. All of this leads to, understandably, a huge peasant uprising against the treatment of the city. But not one to kind of take the message, Ivan actually uses this opportunity to punish people more. All of the people that rose up are herded into their houses and locked in, and then the city is promptly set on fire. It's estimated that as many as half of the city's 30,000 population was killed in these events. And whilst many of the punishments are in some ways unique to the Oprichnina, we shouldn't forget that the 16th century is, of course, a time of much more brutality. It's the time of burning people at the stake for their beliefs. It's the time of the Inquisition. It's the time of leaders being able to hand down violence to their populations. And some historians have suggested that perhaps the way that we describe Ivan's horrors isn't so much about what actually happened. Instead, it's about what we want to think about Russia. What does the West want us to think? There is a certain amount of othering, I think, that takes place with the treatment of Russian history by foreign historians, and I think that's something to bear in mind. But in my personal opinion, I do also think the events of Novgorod are definitely worthy of the horror with which people describe them. It's not only the relentlessness, it's not only the types of torture that are endured, it's also the complete lack of justification given by Ivan. There really is no reason for this brutality. Now, this ultimately brings us to the events of the opera and the miraculous sparing of the neighboring city of Pskov. Now, the opera gives us one version of events, but I would like to suggest another. Obviously, Pskov has seen what happens to Novgorod. So when they see Ivan coming, they ride out to him on bended knee, groveling for his mercy. Given everything that we've learned about Ivan and his desire for respect, it seems highly likely that he was simply flattered by this groveling. He truly felt that they were his subjects and in their correct place, and perhaps that's why he spared the city. But obviously, I'm very happy to go with the events in the opera as well, that it was struck by family love. So moving away from these horrific events in Novgorod and miraculous events in Pskov, we come now to the last phase of Ivan's reign. There are three major things that I'd like to touch on briefly with you about his reign, because they really pertain to the legacy that he has and to the future of Russia at the time. Two of them relate to further territorial conquests and the other to the succession, and ultimately to the end of Ivan's dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, which would in turn lead to the rise of the Romanov dynasty. So earlier we talked about some of the important gains made by Ivan in the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. But in the 1570s and the 1580s, we see two further hugely significant gains. The first one is in Crimea. The Crimean Khanate had long been an enemy of Russia, and in 1571, stirred on by the fact that they think Russia is so weak, the Crimean Khanate decides to invade, or rather raid. They create a force 40,000 strong and use this to drive to Moscow with the aim of destroying the city and humiliating Ivan. Considering the geography of this for a moment, if I might, the Crimean Khanate is quite far away from Moscow, so I would expect you to be thinking, how on earth could they possibly have got there? And the answer is that basically everyone in Russia at the time was so fed up with Ivan that they were basically like, through you go. So these 40,000 people managed to make it to Moscow relatively easily, and I think that says something about the condition of the lands. So there we go. Now, as the Khanate approaches Moscow, there's only one force that could possibly stand in its way, and that is the Oprichnina. Now, having been created as a private militia loyal only to the Tsar, the Oprichnina has certainly shown themselves capable of a good deal of violence, but it strikes me that they weren't capable of a fair fight. Not only were they heavily outnumbered by the forces of Crimea, they generally seemed to not be that keen on fighting an actual army, instead meting out violence to innocent civilians. So the 1571 raid by the Khanate is an absolutely complete catastrophe for Moscow. They raid the city, they burn the city, and they leave it an absolute shell. But there is a glimmer of hope in this tragic event. It leads Ivan finally to a moment of clarity and to two really important decisions. Firstly, he orders Moscow to be rebuilt. And although he does order it to be rebuilt in wood, he does insist that the buildings are slightly further apart so that the fire will spread more slowly when the next one happens. But more significantly, the Oprichnina is on the verge of collapse. All of their buildings, all of their stables, everything in Moscow has been destroyed. And more importantly than that, they've shown themselves to be completely incapable against an actual enemy. And I think that these two events really save Russia from the raid that will come in 1572. So not content with having destroyed Moscow in 1571, the Khanate really wants to go back for more. And so they decide to attack Ivan again. But having got his act together, it actually turns into a victory for Russia at the Battle of Molody. Now, if Russia had lost this victory, then it really could have seen the state that Ivan ruled over turned into a small, insignificant one. And as for the Khanate of Crimea, why don't they come back in 1573 and finish off the job? Well, ultimately, 50% of their male population had been killed in trying to do so in 1571 and 1572, so they're no longer a viable fighting force. This therefore means that Russia's southern border is safe for the foreseeable future. Safe in one sense, because one final thing to note about the Crimean raids is that ultimately the submission of the Crimean Khanate brings Russia into conflict with another southern neighbor, and that's the Ottoman Empire. And we see in Ivan's reign the beginning of Russo-Turkish wars, a feature of history that will go on until both empires collapse in the First World War. So, moving on to his other very significant acquisition on the eastern borders this time, as opposed to the south. To the east of Moscow lies the Khanate of Sibir. The territory is known for its lucrative fur trade, and one family in particular, who I see are honored on the menu tonight, the Stroganovs, had made a lot of money from the fur trade, pushing further and further east. And this brings them into conflict with the Sibir Khanate. They appeal to Ivan in the early 1580s, hoping that he will offer to help them subdue the Khanate and protect their lucrative trade. But Ivan is too busy with the Livonian War. So the Stroganov family do something rather incredible. They form their own private army and use it to attack the Khanate of Sibir. What follows is a rather insane battle, because the two sides, it really should have been a victory for the Khanate because they massively outnumbered the Stroganovs' private army. But ultimately, this is where we see some of the origins of kind of success in modern warfare. The Stroganovs are equipped with guns. The Khanate don't have guns and don't know what they are. So ultimately, the battle is over in a matter of minutes with the Khanate defeated. This means that Ivan has gained hundreds of miles of territory into the Khanate of Sibir, ultimately bringing Russia into Siberia. And this redefines Russia. It's no longer just a power based in the eastern part of the European continent, but it's also a power based out in the east. So this brings us almost to the end of Ivan's reign, and the final point that I'd like to discuss with you tonight. So as previously mentioned, Ivan had married 8 times, but unfortunately, the only children that we're really concerned with tonight are those from his first marriage. They were to be his successors. So having lost 4 of his children in infancy, Ivan nonetheless had 2 male heirs that survived into adulthood, Ivan the Younger and Fyodor. In a slight imitation of his father, but he will never quite get there, Ivan the Younger had actually already married 3 times by his early 20s, with his first 2 wives being sent away to monasteries for failing to produce children. So when his 3rd wife became pregnant, it was a moment of great celebration in the Rurik household. But unfortunately, it was to be very short-lived, and this was because of Ivan's terrible behavior. There are many versions of events that surround the death of the younger Ivan and also his wife. And the most famous one portrays Ivan in all of his terrible glory. Flying into a rage, initially based on the way in which his daughter-in-law was dressed, Ivan beat her mercilessly, causing her to miscarry and then ultimately to die. Upon hearing of these events, the son was so incensed that he stormed into his father's chambers, an argument ensued, and as depicted in the painting, the father struck the son and the son died. Now, this is highly disputed. I think the events around the daughter-in-law are fairly correct, and that is a suitably irrational reason for Ivan to beat someone. But I do think the ones around the son could be challenged. The main chronicle of the time simply says that Ivan's son ceased to exist. So it's very difficult for us to know what actually happened, but some people have suggested that it could have been illness. Given the science of the time, it's very difficult for us to know really why people died. Most death certificates of the time don't really say anything. But it was quite common for people to really be struck by something and then suddenly die within a matter of days. Indeed, this has happened to poor old Vasily the Adequate. He developed an abscess on his leg and within just a few days was dead. So this could be a suggestion for Ivan's younger son. But either way, the consequences of his son's death are profound. The Rurik dynasty, which has ruled over the territories of what becomes Russia for more than 700 years, will within just a few years die out. Although Ivan had his other son, Fyodor, he was completely incapable of ruling. And so after Fyodor's death in 1598, there are no more Rurik monarchs. As I'm sure many of you know, after this event, after the death of Fyodor, there is the time of Boris Godunov, who also managed to get an opera, followed by the time of troubles in Russia. And then from the time of troubles emerges a certain Mikhail Romanov, who, as we know, will then go on to rule over Russia until 1917. So this brings me to the end of Ivan's turbulent reign, and almost to the end of my talk. There's only one thing that really remains, and that is to address the question that I posed to you at the start. How terrible is Ivan? As I said, part of the problem really does stem from the English-Russian translation. Is it Grozny? Is it terrible? And they do have different meanings. I think that there are several ways of addressing the question of whether or not he's terrible. I think firstly we have to question, what was his reign like for the people of Russia? What was his reign like for the state of Russia? And also, how significant was his reign for both the people and the state? Was it terrible for all of them, or was it actually potentially awe-inspiring, if fearful? Added to all of this, we do have to consider the issues that I've already raised of the sources and the perspective. Even during his reign, a lot of the sources that we have about Ivan come from his enemies and also from foreign observers, some of them being from English noblemen that were visiting the court. And this gives us a very skewed perspective of his reign. What did these people want us to know about Ivan? What did they want us to think about him and his state? Particularly with foreign observers, I think this is an issue. It's certainly no secret that Russia and the West have a complicated relationship, and that this has been the case for centuries. I really think this is exacerbated by the way in which foreign visitors to Russia and foreign historians of Russia write about their experiences and write about the history. I think there's a real tendency to portray Russia as the other, to portray it as something vastly different from the West, both then and now. Their rulers become more brutal, their customs and traditions become more unusual and inexplicable, and generally the whole country becomes very estranged from us. And the question therefore is, why? Why do we do that for Russia? Does this stem from our permanent desire to be kind of suspicious of what we don't know? Or does it come from the kind of phenomenon of wanting to make our own achievements here in the West seem bigger, brighter, more progressive, more monumental, by contrasting them with events from elsewhere that we can label as backwards, simplistic, or even terrible. Whatever the reasons for all of this, it's certainly the case that when dealing with Ivan, there is a tendency to see him as the worst, the most brutal, the most terrible leader of all time, certainly in comparison to some of our own. Now, this isn't to say that I think, therefore, the nickname is completely and utterly undeserved, but I did just want to put that caveat on it. So, returning to the reign of Ivan from the perspective of the people, I really think there isn't much to recommend it, and I therefore think it was pretty terrible. He spent most of his time and energy professing to really care about them, to be devoutly religious and to kind of have their best interests at heart, but ultimately he also spent a lot of time punishing them with war, raids, fire, famine, and death. So I think for the people of Russia, it really was a terrible experience. For the state, though, I think that's what leads us to question whether or not it was wholly terrible. Ivan's reign is brutal, but it is also profoundly important. Not only did he vastly expand the territory that he ruled over, bringing in huge parts of Siberia, pushing Russia into the east, as well as to the south through the Astrakhan Khanate and ultimately the subduing of Crimea, but he also really fundamentally transforms the nature of power in Russia as well. From his adoption of the title of Tsar, through his threatened abdications and negotiation with the boyars, and even the way that he controls the population by using an organization like the Abdication, he certainly leaves a strong legacy for the country. And even though his dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, wouldn't survive, through his first marriage, Ivan manages to elevate a different noble family to prominence, who would, within just about a quarter of a century of Ivan's death, ultimately go on to rule Russia for over 3 centuries and leave what I think we can all agree is an indelible mark. So it would seem that for the people of Russia, the nickname of terrible is, I'm afraid, completely deserved. But for the state and its development, and for the future of Russia, perhaps, and forgive my pronunciation again here, the Russian iteration of Grozny really is more appropriate, as his achievements really inspire both awe and fear, as well as having significant long-term impacts on Russia as a nation. Thank you.
If you look at English archives, you've got Hilary Mantel focusing on a chap who is the Habsburg ambassador, and I'm sure that many of the diplomats writing about Russia did so in a very personal and pretty unfair and inaccurate way. But what have we got? Is there anyone interesting who perhaps has a slightly more balanced view? And is there anyone who is there for long enough to trace a bit of a line of development, what the influences are that are happening at the time, or do they all just come and go, having got their whale oil or whatever it is they've come for, and gone back to England or Vienna?
I'm afraid that the answer is the latter option, that ultimately they don't stick around for very long. A lot of them tend not to stick around because they don't really like what they find. I think, as I've hopefully managed to express, the court of Ivan is not necessarily a place that you wanted to be. I mean, something I didn't really mention is that for a lot of the time, he's not actually in Moscow. He doesn't actually keep anything resembling a proper court. He spends a lot of time a few hundred kilometers outside in a place called Alexandrovna, where he lives ostensibly a monk's life. So people really don't stick around, and particularly as we see, for example, with the marriage proposal to Elizabeth, he actually persuades an English diplomat to take the proposal to her and then return to Russia with the answer, and the diplomat chooses never to return because he fears that if he returns with a no, he will not leave. So unfortunately, it's the latter.
I wonder, in the description of his behaviour and the fact that his first wife was poisoned with mercury, whether there are signs of mercury poisoning in his life, that he had a low-level poisoning that made him mad, in a way.
That's a highly possible theory. So with his first wife, Anastasia, the reason that we can be so sure is that the level of mercury found in her body is higher than we could assume through makeup or hats from the time. And obviously numerous tests have been done on Ivan, and there are also relatively high mercury levels as well. But the difficulty is that again from medicinal cures, or was that distinctly from poisoning? And obviously now the evidence is several centuries old, so it does become rather obscured. But I certainly think in relation to his behavior, Yes, I think that there probably was a certain element of mercury poisoning, and I think there was also a good deal of his lifestyle also really having an impact. You know, he was, as I said, he was very heavy living, and he would, you know, eat and drink an awful lot and live a very lavish lifestyle, and I think that drove him to kind of wild highs and lows, which ultimately took their toll as well.
He takes the title of Tsar, which clearly means Caesar. Was he modelling himself on a Roman emperor? Was he doing anything about his education? Was he sort of taught in the classics for the time? Why this title?
You're absolutely right that it's very significant, and it comes from Moscow, or kind of Russia's desire, and more specifically the Russian Orthodox Church's desire to be seen as the third Rome. So with the collapse of Constantinople in 1453, that's really where the idea comes from. So as I was saying, there's this kind of informal and more infrequent usage that begins in the 1450s, and then Ivan is the one that kind of really grasps the bull by the horns and actually uses that title. And so you're absolutely right, he's definitely trying to invoke that. In terms of his education, I don't know if he studied the classics, but he certainly would have been aware of that allusion.
Okay, so we have no sort of information about whether he studied Latin or whether he was immersed in, whether he studied ancient Greek or any of those kind of details about him.
There's not too many details that I've come across about his childhood. A lot of the time when you do come across them, he's described as being highly neglected. There are even some that suggest he kind of scavenges for food whilst the boyars are dining ahead of him, you know. So I'm sure probably as the heir apparent he was given a thorough education, but I'm afraid the details are a bit sparse. But he has an incredibly religious side, and sometimes in one of his other threatened abdications, he says that he's going to become a monk. And as I mentioned, the Abdication is often kind of based on a monastic order in some of the traditions that it has, and he is profoundly religious, and as you say, wrote religious music.
What did the foreign travellers say about Moscow as a city, either compared to London or other places they were coming from?
I guess the answer would have to be it depends on when you visit, because it really did burn down several times. So if you'd visited Moscow, I think in the 1540s before the fire, it would have been a relatively impressive and fairly significant and substantial city, largely constructed of wood, but then obviously with the central Kremlin, which would have been stone. After 1547, obviously it was largely burnt, so then you would have had to see the rebuilding. And then in the 1560s, as I mentioned, he spends a lot of time not in Moscow, actually outside in Alexandrovna. So the city does suffer from neglect. So I think visiting in the 1560s, or certainly kind of 1571 after the Crimean raids, would have been distinctly unimpressive. It's only really around the time of the end of Ivan's reign that we would start to see it being rebuilt in any type of substantial way. And it remains, again, as I joked, in wood for the most part, apart from the central cathedrals and the Kremlin. So I think to a foreign observer that was perhaps used to some of the grander Italian cities or something like that, it probably would have seemed a little bit more plain.
What was going on between, if anything, between Moscow and Central Asia or China at the time? Was there much exchange going that way?
Going east, well, a large part of the trade is furs, and that's why they want Siberia. And then as you kind of go outside Russia, they're mostly surrounded by Khanates. And those gradually fade away after the time of Ivan's reign, and we start to see it being replaced by kind of different powers. But ultimately, Central Asia isn't fully brought under Russian control until the reign of Alexander II in the 19th century. So they remain as relatively nominally independent powers for quite some time. As opposed to exactly what's going on in China in the 16th century, I'm afraid I don't know. It's not my area of expertise.
I'm enjoying my time here. I'm drinking Ivan the Terrible. And as a Russian, I feel the things which happened 500 years ago in me. So my question to you, do you feel like some of your leaders, like 500 years ago or more or less, get something to your code, you know? Because it's still going on 500 years later. Yes or no? Thank you very much.
That's an absolutely brilliant question, and I'm very worried about sounding incredibly unpatriotic. But having spent a lot of time in Russia, I would say that one of the things I love about Russians is that sense of feeling your history. I think that English people do have that as well, but perhaps not quite to the same extent. And I think one of the things that I also love about Russians is the breadth with which you seem to know of it. I think in this country, and I'll take the blame as a history teacher, we tend to kind of teach the same things over and over again. So everyone can probably tell you about Henry VIII and his wives and then the causes of the First World War. But other than that, it might be a bit patchy. But I always feel when I talk to Russians that you have such a broad understanding of your history, and perhaps that contributes to you feeling it kind of all the more. I certainly feel English history, but that's because I talk about it day in, day out at work to my long-suffering students. So for the rest of the population, it might be a bit different.
Since your pupils are so lucky, how many other pupils are there doing A-level history, A-level Russian history, for example, in Britain?
Goodness, I don't actually know how many people do history. I know certainly at Westminster, we're one of the more popular A-levels. And we also teach, all of our GCSE syllabus is kind of Russia-based because I designed it. Someone was like, French Revolution? No. There's 2 in Russia, we'll do those. So I teach a lot of it, and I know Westminster does. I think nationally it is quite popular. So I know that OCR, who's one of our biggest exam boards, I think the biggest in the country, has a brilliant paper from the Crimean War all the way through to the fall of Khrushchev. So I think it's kind of more common than other types of history. Although I would say that obviously the most prevalent is Nazi Germany. I think you can't throw a stick in a history classroom without encountering someone teaching it. So I don't think it's the most taught, but I do think any student of history in their 7 years at secondary school will probably get some Russia. But it probably wouldn't be Ivan. Because ultimately, unfortunately, earlier history is falling out of favor. A lot of history syllabuses now do focus on the 20th century because it seems to be slightly more entertaining to young people, and also there's more sources available and things like that. So I don't actually even get to teach Ivan. This is just a side interest.
It's quite difficult for us to judge one ruler in a particular period because that period is quite alien to us. But how would Ivan be judged against, say, King Philip of Spain, who seems to have been as much a religious zealot as Ivan? And how would he be regarded in relation to other leaders of his time?
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think the answer is that when you put him in comparison with other leaders, he probably does seem slightly less terrible. I think it is that issue of we kind of downplay our horrors and our events like that from the past, and we focus instead on the horrors of others. Henry VIII, everyone knows how many wives he had, but they seem to forget how many Catholics he killed as part of the Reformation, and how many people he burnt at the stake. Mary, his daughter, gets the reputation for being bloody, but actually Henry killed far more people in his time on the throne. So, and it kind of builds on what Andre said, that history is written and rewritten. And I think that depending on the angle you want to put across, you change how the leader comes across. And I think with Ivan, he's a great person to terrorize, as it were, and to kind of pile everything onto him and say he truly was just that terrible. But with a reign that spans 51 years, it literally can't all have been bad. Similarly with Henry VIII, ruling for 30 years, the early years are quite good, and it's only in the later years that it all goes downhill. So it's really just as you say, a question of comparison and a question of interpretation and emphasis. And ultimately, when you put him in that wider European context, the 16th century is the time of the Reformation. So there's so much violence across so much of Europe. It really is quite astonishing that we kind of point to Russia and say they were being so violent when, people in what is now Germany, France, Spain, this country were, as I said, kind of being burned at the stake and other such gruesome tortures for their beliefs. And that's what we see Ivan doing.
What was the attitude of Soviet historians and politicians to Ivan the Terrible?
The attitude is difficult, because obviously Russia's imperial past is something that the Soviets want to use for a distinct historical narrative. So because communism was the kind of ultimate triumph and it was always coming, everything in the past therefore was building towards it, and so had to be pretty grim. So the treatment in some ways is negative, because you want to make it as bad as possible, because then it oppressed the people, and then they obviously rose up, and then we have the glories of the October Revolution and Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. But actually the figure of Ivan comes to be in some ways treated more kindly because of the way in which he was seen as a state builder. So through his acquisitions of the various khanates, through his extension out into Siberia, and also through the way that he had authority. And I think it comes down to that kind of very trite mantra of the ends justifying the means. And I think that when you look at what Ivan does, as I said, for Russia, in terms of the acquisition and the structures of power that he creates, that is quite impressive. And so those parts of his reigns were emphasized, because obviously the Soviets couldn't ignore all of Russian history and just say they were all absolutely terrible. They had to find some people to focus on. And so during the Soviet time, there were some relatively positive images of Ivan as a state builder, as a kind of authoritative leader. So it was, as ever, quite mixed, but certainly from Stalin's perspective, relatively positive. There's also a brilliant letter that I just remembered, that when Nicholas II is at the front and everything's not going terribly well, the Tsarina writes to him and she says, "Be a good leader, be an Ivan the Terrible," which I always think is quite good.
It was a good question about how Ivan Terrible was accepted during Soviet time, because it's like a new time for him. And just recently, it was a big article of a head of Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, former director of FSB, who said about Ivan Terrible just like a perfect man. And exactly it means everything what was we could talk about Stalin, and we easily can reflect it to modern Russia as well. And it's very interesting how is this period of time, what was this in the 16th century, in the Stalin's time, now it's very similar in the modern Russia also.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the writing and rewriting of history.
The story of the opera, so the love session, the going to the town, discovering Olga's mother, meeting Olga, the shooting. What percentage would you say is true and what percentage is totally made up?
Oh goodness, I'm going to have to try and be very diplomatic and say I couldn't possibly put a figure on it, but I think perhaps I could just say with Ivan, it could all be true. That would be my diplomatic answer, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much.